I was talking with this Nigerian girl, and she was telling me about how in African culture it's normalized to hit your kids.
Mhm.
And I found that quite interesting in that my my response was that like, yeah, I feel like it's a bad way to solve a problem. I think like you can communicate the same message to your child, but in way healthier ways. But her African heritage normalizes it, and her argument was that it's a kind of call to discipline, that the discipline then creates the respect. It's kind of like if you touch a stove and you get burnt, you don't touch the stove again. You don't misbehave once you get hit as a child. And then she backed it up with this little Bible verse that basically refers to how it refers to like a rod, and how like the rod is something that saves them, in terms of like the rod symbolizing like punishment and how that actually helps people. So I found it quite interesting about like how there is something to her argument in that maybe sometimes raising your voice, if we're not going down that much extreme of we don't have to go down the extreme of hitting your kids, but the concept of raising your voice, the emotional tone is enough to prevent behavior. So um, I guess I'm kind of directing to how motivation works, um, how how we can how we can influence sort of um, children behavior, and how we can both kind of like we can motivate them with fear. Like it is something that works, but I'm wondering how much it works. So I'd like to know what you kind of know about child psychology, and if and your thoughts on this before I continue.
Yeah, I mean, it's controversial to a degree, and it's complex, and it's nuanced. I mean, there are many other ways to discipline, obviously, but having, a sense of discipline and authority is important. But what I was writing here while you were talking was, yes, you have to be an authority to your children, but you can't be a monster to them. And that world is a slippery slope, because if you decide to, hit them for one reason, does the bar to that punishment drop lower and lower? Do you know what I mean? Like, is there some? How do you know that you're disciplined enough as a parent to know when it's right to bring that, like, precaution out? Like, it would just not be something I would ever go down, because it's so messy and like risky, and like
Mm.
there are other ways to discipline. There are other punishments, to use a sort of precarious word, that one can do. I mean, for me as a kid, if I really stepped out of line, I mean, I was a good kid anyway, generally, but um, if I stepped out of line, we had a thing called Sweetie Saturday, where I could go to the shop and spend £1.50 on sweets or something. If I was naughty in the week, then Sweetie Saturday would be taken away. And that was enough of a, of a deterrence to not step out of line. But, I don't know, man, it's complicated. But that's why I'd say, you have to be an authority, but you can't be a monster. You want respect from your children, but if your children are scared of you, not good. Not good.
Mm. Yeah. I think the best way to do is to get the child itself to think that that behavior is wrong. So let's take say your 3-year-old bit another kid in nursery.
Mm.
If I think the best way to go about that is to get your child to feel inside that the guilt of that action, and you
Mm.
somehow have to get that across, that like the that would be the best case scenario, solving that, in that like putting them on the naughty step to reflect about why biting children is wrong is maybe more ideal. The other thing that I thought
Do
about
you have that capacity at 3? I don't know. Like, what I've written here is development of superego. That's important. The conscience, 100%. But at
mm,
3, are you still, like, too much, like, reward and punishment thinking, you know?
that's the problem, I suppose, because maybe at a young age children can't rationalize it, and therefore they need that kind of like instinct that, okay, if I bite Henry again, I'm gonna get slapped.
Yeah.
So biting Henry equals bad.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think, yeah, it is a kind of like complex issue, but I also feel like the kind of being a bit like using fear, I think, is actually only short term as well. But I think that would be the disadvantage in that, like, sort of being shouted at, it works in the short term, but that might not actually prevent the behavior. So if that, like, if there was a 9-year-old that was to hit another child, in school, that if like he used fear, that would work for a couple weeks and he wouldn't go around hitting. But then after that fear kind of like went away, it kind of drifted off, that he might go back to it because that behavior hasn't necessarily been hit at the core. Um, that it can, that they don't, that 9-year-old is able to rationalize it a bit. So he hasn't been showed the guilt that it is wrong. And yeah, um,
Well, the problem with punishment is that it's not always obvious or easy to make sure that the feedback that the punishment is about the behavior. It's not super easy to establish that relationship clearly. Like sometimes punishment gets associated with being caught rather than the actual behavior itself. Or in this case, the fear may not be attached to the undesirable behavior, but instead attached to the parent. Rather than being afraid to, you know, step out of line, bite that kid again, whatever, throw your mashed potato across the room. The fear instead is associated with, if I do this, then mummy or daddy are going to do something to me. And then mummy or daddy become the source of fear, not the antisocial behavior. Does that make sense?
mm, yeah. I think the hardest part is when they're very young, because isn't there that thing where like if a child isn't socially educated by like 3 years old, then they're gonna never be their whole life or something,
Mm,
and that like a percentage of children that are like they're the biters, they're the kickers, they do all that kind of thing in nursery, in 2 to 3, and then they're more likely to be sort of serial killers if that doesn't get fixed. So it's like a problem that like those early years is like the most important, and there needs to be like not any like behavioral like big things that are ignored. I think there's also something in that like there's the other side of kind of how we look at motivation, and that there's the reward in that like rewarding them for good behaviors, and like what your mum did of like preventing that reward for bad behaviors. That's pretty good, to be fair. I think that's a pretty nice way to do it. Um it in that they will get recognized almost for the opposite. So when they show kindness, they get rewarded. But when they show a bit more sort of aggression, then they don't get those rewards anymore. I think that's a powerful tool to use as well.
mm. Like I remember, this is quite a sort of weird story that's just coming to my mind. But I remember being a kid, and it was one time where um, there was like it was like a flying ant season in the UK, which is like for some reason 1 or 2 days a year, I think, these insects called flying ants just breed or they hatch aggressively, and then there's like thousands of them flying around. I don't know if people get what I'm saying by that. But anyway, this one year it was that, and I must have been, I don't know, 7, maybe younger. Um, and there was these 2 flying ants that had like been injured or something. They were just on the floor in the garden. And my mum was like, don't step on those. And when just somebody says don't do something and it makes you really want to do it. And as a kid, you haven't really got like much moral reasoning. So I think I just ended up like pretending like I didn't mean to, but I stepped on these 2 flying ants and killed them. And then my mum was like, right, no sweeties on Saturday for like 3 weeks. Because to her, that idea of just harming an innocent thing for no reason, that was a big crime. Which now, please, she did it, because now, ever since that point, I don't kill insects. I just don't. If there's a spider in the room, I'll grab a bit of paper and a cup and put it out the window. Even when people try and swat flies, I don't like it. So maybe that's a little bit of classical conditioning from back in the day, that like it was, because to me that punishment was quite harsh. Like 3 weeks of no sweetie Saturday, like that's aggressive. Um, instilled in me the idea that you don't kill innocent beings, even if they're just insects.